My baby might be gone. The words came out hollow, like she was already bracing herself for the worst, like she'd spent the past 72 hours rehearsing this exact sentence in her mind, preparing herself for the moment when her worst fears would be confirmed by someone with medical authority, who would give her the news she'd been dreading with clinical detachment. Before we dive deeper, every day we make videos like this, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Back to the story. It was April 1945, inside a British military medical tent that smelled of iodine and canvas, and the particular metallic scent that seemed to permeate every military medical facility, regardless of which army operated it. A scent that came from blood and antiseptic, and the copper taste of fear that seemed to hang in the air around injured and sick people, who had no choice but to wait for help from strangers who wore enemy uniforms. A pregnant German POW named Margaret lay quietly on a narrow bed that had thin blankets and a mattress that was barely more than stuffed canvas over wooden slats, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, in the universal gesture of pregnant women throughout history who instinctively try to shield their unborn children even when the threat is invisible and internal, afraid to move too much because movement might confirm what she suspected, that the stillness she'd been feeling for days wasn't just her imagination or exhaustion, but something far worse. The camp where she'd been held for the past 3 weeks was one of dozens that had been established across the occupied territories to process the massive influx of German prisoners who were surrendering or being captured as the Reich collapsed in on itself like a dying star. And this particular facility had been set up near the Belgian border in a former factory complex that had been bombed out during the earlier years of the war and now served as a temporary holding area for prisoners awaiting classification and eventual transfer to more permanent detention facilities. Margaret had been captured along with a group of civilian refugees who'd been trying to flee westward away from the advancing Soviet forces, and during the initial processing, the British soldiers had discovered she was 6 months pregnant, which had complicated her status significantly because the various military bureaucracies hadn't quite worked out protocols for dealing with pregnant POWs, and there were questions about whether she should be held with the general population or given special accommodation or perhaps released on humanitarian grounds, questions that were still being debated by officers in distant headquarters while she waited in limbo. She hadn't felt movement for days, no reassurance of the kicks and rolls that had become familiar over the past months, no answers to the desperate questions she kept asking herself in the long hours of the night when she lay awake on her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of other prisoners coughing and crying and talking in their sleep about things they couldn't say during waking hours. When the British surgeon examined her, she turned her face away, already convinced she knew what he would say, already preparing herself for the formal confirmation that the life inside her had stopped, that the stress and malnutrition and trauma of the past months had finally taken their toll in the most devastating way possible, that she would have to endure not just captivity, but also the loss of the only thing that had kept her moving forward through the collapse of everything else in her world. The surgeon was a man named Captain James Aldridge, who'd been practicing medicine for 15 years before the war and had volunteered for military service in 1940, despite being old enough that he could have stayed in civilian practice. Motivated by a combination of patriotic duty and the sense that his skills would be needed in the coming conflict, in ways that would test everything he'd learned in medical school and the years of practice that had followed. He'd served in field hospitals in North Africa and Italy, had performed surgeries under conditions that would have been unthinkable in a proper hospital, had learned to make quick decisions with incomplete information and limited supplies, had developed the kind of steady hands and calm demeanor that came from working through crisis after crisis until crisis became the normal baseline of existence. The tent went silent when he placed his stethoscope against her swollen belly, too silent in that particular way that medical examinations become when the practitioner is concentrating intensely on sounds that might be present or might be absent, listening for the rapid flutter of a fetal heartbeat that should be there but might not be. And everyone in the tent, including the 2 nurses assisting and the guard who stood by the entrance, seemed to hold their breath collectively, as if they understood, without being told, that something important hung in the balance. She watched his expression change, saw the slight furrow of his brow deepen and then smooth out again, saw his eyes move as he reposited the stethoscope and listened again from a different angle, and her heart sank because she interpreted these micro-expressions as confirmation of her fears, as the surgeon's way of double-checking bad news before he had to deliver it, and she found herself wondering in a strange detached way whether they would let her bury the child or whether camp regulations would require some other disposal method that would deny her even that small ritual of grief. Then the surgeon spoke, slowly and carefully, in the kind of measured tone that doctors use when they need to communicate complex information to patients who are already on the edge of panic, explaining in his accented German that was better than most British officers managed that what she feared wasn't certain, that he couldn't find a heartbeat with the stethoscope, which was concerning but not necessarily conclusive, because sometimes the position of the baby made it difficult to hear, that there were other signs he needed to evaluate before making any determination, that the baby's position seemed unusual, which might indicate a problem, or might simply be an anatomical variation that happens sometimes in pregnancy. There was still a chance, he told her, his voice carrying a cautious optimism that seemed almost cruel in its refusal to confirm her worst assumptions, but also offered a thread of hope that she was afraid to grasp, because hope in her experience over the past year had usually led to worse disappointment when it was inevitably crushed. He explained that he needed to perform a more thorough examination, that he wanted to try to manually determine the baby's position and see if he could prompt some movement, that there were techniques he'd learned during his obstetric training that might help assess fetal viability, even without modern diagnostic equipment like the X-ray machines that would have made this evaluation much simpler, but which weren't available in a temporary POW camp medical facility. Margaret nodded her consent, because what choice did she have? Because she was a prisoner and a German and pregnant in a British military camp, and her agency in this situation was essentially non-existent. But also because despite everything, some part of her still wanted to believe that her baby might be alive, that the stillness she'd been feeling might be explained by something other than death, that this British surgeon, who had no reason to care about the life of a German prisoner's unborn child, might somehow be able to offer her a miracle. Hours later, after an examination that was uncomfortable and frightening and conducted with a gentleness she hadn't expected from enemy medical personnel, after the surgeon had called in a more experienced obstetrician who happened to be visiting from a larger medical facility nearby, after they'd consulted in low voices and performed additional assessments, and finally determined that the baby was in breech position, which explained both the lack of visible movement and the difficulty in detecting a heartbeat with standard auscultation. After they'd worked carefully to try to manually reposition the fetus into a more favorable position using external manipulation techniques that were painful but not dangerous, the fear finally broke, not into the screams of loss she'd been anticipating, but into tears that came from somewhere so deep inside her that they seemed to bypass her conscious control entirely. Tears, not of loss, but of relief that flooded through her entire body, when the surgeon finally smiled and told her that he'd found the heartbeat, that it was strong and steady, that the baby was alive and, as far as he could tell, in no immediate danger despite the unusual positioning. Against everything she expected in a POW camp, where she'd assumed that medical care would be minimal and grudging at best, where she'd feared that her status as an enemy prisoner would mean her baby's life would be considered expendable, or at least a low priority, compared to the needs of Allied personnel. Her baby was saved through the dedicated effort of medical professionals who'd spent hours working on a problem that had no strategic military value whatsoever, but mattered immensely on a human level. The obstetrician who'd been called in was a major named Patricia Thornton, who'd been one of the first women to qualify as a military surgeon in the British Army, and who'd fought constant battles throughout her career to be taken seriously by male colleagues who assumed women weren't capable of handling the physical and emotional demands of battlefield medicine. And she'd developed a particular interest in managing complicated pregnancies in crisis situations, partly because it was an area where her expertise was undeniable, and partly because she'd lost her own first child to a miscarriage early in the war, and carried that loss with her in a way that made her especially determined to save other women's babies when she had the chance. She and Captain Aldridge worked together with a coordination that came from mutual respect and shared commitment to their profession's core principle that all lives deserved protection regardless of nationality or circumstance. And they explained to Margaret, through a translator, that the baby needed to be monitored carefully over the coming weeks, that she should report any concerning symptoms immediately, that they were going to recommend she be moved to a facility with better medical resources where she could be observed more closely as her pregnancy progressed, that they would do everything possible to ensure both she and her child survived to delivery, despite the less than ideal conditions of captivity and post-war chaos. Margaret would later say, in interviews she gave decades after the war when historians were trying to document the experiences of women during that period, that moment wasn't just about survival, wasn't just about the physical preservation of her unborn child's life, though that was obviously the most immediate and important outcome. It was the moment she realized that even in captivity, even as a prisoner of a nation she'd been taught to view as the enemy, even in circumstances where she had every reason to expect cruelty or at minimum indifference, life somehow still had a future. That not everything about humanity had been destroyed by the years of war and propaganda and dehumanization. That there were still people who would choose to act with compassion and professional dedication, even when it would have been easier to do the minimum required or nothing at all. She gave birth 3 months later, in July 1945, at a displaced persons hospital that had been established in a former monastery near Brussels, and the delivery was complicated by the breech position that had never fully resolved, despite the earlier manipulation, requiring a difficult manual extraction that was performed by Major Thornton, who'd specifically requested to be present for the birth after having invested so much effort in keeping the pregnancy viable. The baby, a girl whom Margaret named Anna after her own mother, who died in the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, was born healthy despite all the prenatal stress and complications, weighing just under 6 pounds, but with strong lungs that announced her arrival to the entire ward. And Margaret held her daughter for the first time, with tears streaming down her face, while Major Thornton looked on, with her own eyes suspiciously wet. 2 women who would never see each other again after that day, but who were connected forever by this moment of shared humanity in the midst of historical catastrophe. The months that followed were difficult in different ways, as Margaret navigated the bureaucratic nightmare of being a German civilian in occupied territory, with an infant to care for and no husband, because the father had been killed in the fighting outside Berlin in the war's final weeks. And she spent time in various displaced persons camps, while authorities tried to figure out what to do with the millions of Germans who were now refugees in their own demolished country. She eventually made her way back to what remained of her hometown in Bavaria, found distant relatives who took her in, rebuilt a life from almost nothing through a combination of determination and the random luck of surviving when so many others hadn't. And she raised Anna in the new Federal Republic, telling her daughter stories about the war years that emphasized survival and resilience, without dwelling too much on the trauma and loss that had shaped that entire generation. Anna grew up healthy and strong, never knowing how close she'd come to not existing at all, never fully comprehending until much later what it had meant for her mother to be pregnant in a POW camp during the collapse of Nazi Germany. And she would have her own children and tell them the story of how their grandmother had been saved by British doctors who'd cared enough to spend hours working on a problem that had no strategic importance but mattered infinitely on a personal scale. Captain James Aldridge returned to civilian practice after the war, opening a clinic in a working-class neighbourhood of Manchester where he treated generations of families through the decades of post-war rebuilding and social change, and he carried with him countless memories of the war years, including that afternoon in April 1945, when he and Major Thornton had worked together to save an unborn child who had no idea she was caught in the machinery of history and military conflict and just needed competent medical care delivered with compassion. He would sometimes tell the story to medical students during lectures about the importance of treating every patient with full attention and care, regardless of circumstances, using it as an example of how medical ethics required doctors to see past political categories and national boundaries to the fundamental human reality of suffering and need. And more than one young doctor would cite that story years later as the moment they understood what it really meant to practice medicine according to its highest principles. Major Patricia Thornton went on to become one of the leading voices in military medical policy during the post-war years, advocating for better treatment of civilian casualties and prisoners of war, pushing for reforms that would ensure medical care was delivered according to need rather than nationality, and drawing on her experiences in places like that Belgian POW camp to argue that militaries had obligations to humanity that transcended narrow definitions of strategic necessity. She retired as a colonel in 1968 and spent her remaining years teaching at a medical school in Edinburgh, where she was known for her fierce dedication to her students and her insistence that medicine was fundamentally about serving human dignity in all its vulnerable forms. And when she died in 1983, her obituary in the British Medical Journal mentioned her wartime service and specifically noted her commitment to treating all patients, including enemy prisoners, with the same standard of care she would have provided to her own troops. None of these three people, the surgeon, the obstetrician, and the pregnant prisoner whose baby they saved, ever saw each other again after 1945, separated by the currents of history and geography and the simple vastness of the post-war world, where millions of people were trying to rebuild lives and nations were trying to establish new orders, and individuals were just trying to survive and maybe find some measure of peace. But their brief intersection in that medical tent in April 1945 rippled forward through time in ways that none of them could have predicted. Through Anna, who lived to have children and grandchildren of her own. Through the students that both doctors taught, who carried forward their example of compassionate professional care. Through the small ways that acts of decency in dark times affirm that humanity is not just an abstract concept, but a set of choices that individuals make moment by moment, even when systems and nations and entire civilizations seem determined to abandon it. The medical tent itself was dismantled within months of that day, packed up and shipped elsewhere, or simply torn down and discarded as the temporary POW camps were closed and prisoners were processed and released or to choose compassion over indifference, even when no one would have blamed them for taking the easier path. And in making those choices to create small pockets of light in what seems like overwhelming darkness, small affirmations that the better angels of human nature have not been completely extinguished by war and hatred, and all the forces that work constantly to convince us that cruelty is inevitable and kindness is weakness, and that the lives of our enemies do not matter. Margaret died in 1992 at the age of 76, having lived long enough to see Germany reunified and the Cold War ended, and the emergence of a European order that would have seemed impossible in 1945 when she lay in that medical tent fearing the worst. And among her papers, her children found a faded letter she'd written, but never sent to Captain Aldridge and Major Thornton, thanking them for saving her daughter's life, and explaining how that act of mercy had given her reason to believe in the possibility of reconstruction and reconciliation when everything else suggested only permanent division and transferred. And nothing physical remains of the space where this small miracle of life occurred, except perhaps some documents in military archives recording a pregnant German POW who received medical treatment in April 1945, with a note about successful management of a breech presentation. But the meaning of what happened there persists in the stories that were told and retold, in the lives that were lived because of decisions made in that moment, in the example it provides of what humans can choose to be for each other, even in the worst circumstances history can devise. A reminder that even when nations are at war and ideologies clash, and the machinery of conflict grinds millions of people into casualties and statistics, there remain these moments when individuals can step outside the logic of enmity and conflict to simply care for another human being who needs help, to use their skills and knowledge not to destroy, but to preserve life. A letter she'd apparently written in the late 1940s, but had never been able to send because she had no address for them and no way to track down British military personnel who'd long since returned to civilian life. So it remained unread in her desk drawer as a private testament to gratitude that could never be properly expressed but needed to be written anyway. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. There are many more real accounts like this. Don't miss the next one.